This video is kindly sponsored by the Loading Crew's complete Waifu Handbook, compatible with Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, Pathfinder, and Pathfinder 2e. So stay tuned to find out more. Once again, we see there is no character you love which I cannot take away. My Adventures with Superman is an animated series made in that malformed quasi-anime style Western studios seem to love so much, and every character, along with their dialogue, is written in that boilerplate, totally quirky style Western studios seem to love even more. And at a glance, we're already hit with many telltale signs that have signaled the downfall of many a popular franchise. Things like a soft leading man, a central character altered for no other reason than to meet the political demands of the social landscape, and of course, a masculine female character who will usurp the lead position from the show's leading man, usually by mandate of the writers. Like Picard overtaken by Soji, Kenobi overtaken by Leia and Reva, and He-Man infamously overtaken by Teela. And so, of course, given the track record spanning back years of the mainstream and its penchant for making even beloved female characters into shameless Mary Sues, one could be excused for expecting this new tomboy Lois Lane to be yet another author stand-in demanding all spotlight and attention, while having Superman worship her every step as she constantly makes him look like an idiot. So, the unfortunate question looming over this new Superman series is this Lois Lane a Mary Sue? Well, after watching the first 5 episodes, I think there's more than enough material to gauge this version of Lois Lane fairly well. In fact, I'd say we only needed one. Without lingering too long on the topic, a quick rundown of a Mary Sue is a particular kind of character who bends the laws of the world and logic around her. And by now, the classic example is Rey from Disney's Star Wars, and at this point many might be tired of hearing her name. However, it's not really my fault Disney created such a perfect example of a god mode Mary Sue that she became this one-stop shop example of what not to do. And Rey achieving great force abilities in her very first movie with no training whatsoever despite literal decades of established Star Wars lore, requiring training for everyone else is quite the red flag. In other words, she breaks the established logic of the universe just so the writer can show off their totally cool original character. Donut Steele. In the most despised woke-era media, your average moviegoer can expect to encounter Mary Sues that have extraordinary abilities that are ultimately unearned in the eyes of the audience. Which means these Mary Sues tend to have great power without the great responsibility, which could be tolerable, even more so from a side character, if these powers weren't given in part for the purpose of showing up or belittling established characters whose journeys we've already seen play out. For example, when Rey could fix the Millennium Falcon better than Han Solo. The very poor writing behind Rey's character might be using this to show off how totally smart she is, because she collects scrap for a living and therefore can fix all the things. Unfortunately, there's no build-up. There's no moment where Rey struggles to figure things out, where she connects the dots under the pressure of an attack. She just knows the answer. And so the audience is left remembering all the movies and games and comics they've read over the years, all about Han Solo and his Millennium Falcon, and all the years he spent with it, all the adventures he had in it, and what an iconic trio he and Chewie made with it. Han earned his knowledge of the Falcon, and so the audience is left wondering why this newbie with no experience with the Falcon is suddenly more knowledgeable of the Falcon than the guy who fought a war in it. To put this in perspective, somehow Han Solo's years of smuggling in the Falcon and 3 movies of his pain, struggle, and suffering is worth less than Rey's starting knowledge of a ship she has no experience in? That dog won't hunt, Monsignor. Also, everyone just thinks this absolute nobody is super awesome and cool, for no other reason than all the other characters must know she's the main one. And this apparently includes the plot, since it just gifts this totally random nobody Anakin's iconic lightsaber. Morality centered around a character rather than a philosophy. Another standard Mary Sue trope. I've said this before, but it really does feel like Disney's Star Wars was just a shoddy D&D campaign, with Rey played by the Dungeon Master's girlfriend, or more likely, the girl he really wants to get with. Again, the established logic of the universe is broken. This is what I mean when I say Mary Sue's bend the laws and logic of the world around her. For everyone else, it's a level grind. For a Mary Sue, it's pay to win. Minus the payment part. But does this hip new tomboy Lois Lane meet these criteria? My Adventures with Superman's version of Lois Lane is spunky, quirky, and totally not like other girls. See, she's into robots, you guys, and always wears pants, even at high-class events. So as much as fans like making surface level level comparisons between her and Casca from Berserk, at least within the first 5 episodes, Lois Lane doesn't go to the whole scene Casca did, or even she shows up to a formal event in a dress and finds that she prefers feeling feminine. To highlight the full circumstance of her character, IMDb describes the second episode like this: Clark Kent builds his secret Superman identity and embraces his role as the hero of Metropolis, while sharing adventures and falling in love with Lois, a star investigative journalist who also takes Jimmy Olsen under her wing. Lois, already a star investigative journalist who's already Jimmy Olsen's mentor, and who Clark Kent/Superman instantly falls in love with at first sight. And unsurprisingly, the first thing he does is embarrass himself in front of her. Not to mention that in her very first episode, she already has a video presentation ready on a story no one else is following because it's too far-fetched. But of course, she's right about it. On the surface, it seems Lois was just handed this awesome story by the writers, just because she's so awesome. How awesome exactly? Lois Lane actually saves Superman a number of times. In fact, one could argue it's a regular occurrence. And because, of course, any proper Mary Sue side character must upstage the male lead in his own show, right, fellow allies? Picard, He-Man, and Kenobi might agree. In the very first episode, Superman is overwhelmed by a gang of powerful enemies. Fortunately, Lois Lane was there to save the day by simply pressing the off button. And yes, that's literally what happened. And again in episode 2, when a professional thief plants explosives all over the city and threatens to set them off unless she's allowed to leave. Lois is there to grab the detonator in the chaos. And as Superman is being thrashed by Super Tech in episode 4, it's Lois who once again steps in to save the day while Superman flounders. And oddly enough, just by switching things off again. And finally, Lois Lane's participation in one of the most annoying current trends in modern media, becoming furious at Clark Kent for daring not to tell her his secret identity. Because liars are evil, or something. Never mind that the two haven't known each other for very long, or that the entire first episode is about Lois Lane lying to Clark and Jimmy, or that Lois overtly vowed to expose all of Superman's secrets, and the fact that Clark and Lois aren't even dating yet. No, forget all of that. Clark should have trusted the ambitious, aspiring journalist, who often puts that ambition over everything else, with his most protected secret. This trend is so destructive. When Amber from Invincible pulled this, it ruined her character in a single scene. And the fallout from My Adventure with Superman episode 5 has seen a similar reaction. The ending of episode 5 left Lois Lane's character teetering on the abyss. And considering the episode is called You Will Believe a Man Can Lie, the blame may well be placed entirely on Superman's back. So, taking all of this into consideration, the answer to the burning question as to whether Lois Lane is a Mary Sue is a resounding no. The reality is, each of the situations mentioned above were merely circumstantial. If you recall the earlier examples with Ray, the real complaints are never about the events themselves or the abilities themselves, but the denial of the established logic. A Mary Sue isn't just about power level or skills, but also the context of the world's logic. In other words, a Mary Sue is relative to the plot of the world. A proper Jedi who earned his powers, for example, is an acceptable character in Star Wars, but a character who can dominate minds and block bullets might be rather Mary Sue-ish in the world of John Wick or Jack Reacher. And so, it isn't the fact that Rey suddenly has force powers, or was given the super secret legendary lightsaber, or even that she fixed the Millennium Falcon when Han Solo couldn't. It's that none of these were logically earned. Here's what I mean. Had we seen Rey working on the Millennium Falcon, maybe see her grumbling about some modifications or upgrades Unkar Plutt added to the ship, we get a setup for Rey's familiarity with the ship, and establish that the ship has been altered, and so is now different from Han Solo's memory of the ship, and that Rey also has experience with these modifications. This way, we can understand why Han Solo has such unfamiliarity with his old ship, and why Rey knows more than he does. On an off note, this might explain why ripping something out makes the ship run better, especially since the modifications or upgrades could be somewhat incompatible with the ship. With this in place, we have a reasonable answer to the glaring question, why can Rey fix the Falcon better than Han Solo? Other than, she's just super awesome and knows all the things. In summary, it wasn't the fact that Rey fixed the Falcon, it was the lack of logic behind the event. So how does all of this tie into tomboy Lois Lane? Well, let's see. First off, the IMDb description calling Lois a star investigative journalist who becomes Jimmy's mentor is actually a lie. The reality is, according to the show's canon, Lois Lane is just an intern. And the part where she acts as Olsen's mentor is more of a joke, since she, Clark, and Olsen are all Daily Planet interns. And Lois's mentor role is just teaching the new guys how to pour coffee copy and scan papers. This isn't even about correcting a falsehood, but pointing out the core of Lois Lane's character arc. Because yes, she does have a character arc, and it's one she has to work for. And this brings us back to the robot poster in her room. This isn't just something to prove that Lois Lane isn't like other girls. The poster is actually a plot setup. You see, Lane might not be a superstar journalist, but her greatest ambition is to become one. So, aside from occasionally doing her intern work, she also investigates potential stories in an attempt to earn that role. Unlike the modern Mary Sue, Lois Lane isn't just handed advancement, nor does she feel entitled to it. And more importantly, she's very willing to earn it. So how does all this relate to the robot poster? The story Lois Lane was following involves stolen experimental military technology, and among the technology stolen were a batch of robots. Lois might be totally quirky or whatever, but she's also ambitious, clever, and has a fantastic work ethic. From the very first time we see Lois, evidence of her work is scattered all over the scene. She's called into Mr. White's office, believing he's finally going to give her a shot at that sacred reporter badge. And this is why she has a video package prepared by the time she arrives. It's clearly a compilation of footage she's collected from security cameras, all done on her own time. If she were a current year Mary Sue, she might have been right, but more likely, Mr. White would reject Lois Lane's hard work and keep her as an intern because women shouldn't be doing stories like this. Something oppression, something girl power, blah blah blah. Lois Lane would be the righteous woman breaking the glass ceiling, and Mr. White would be the evil, comically sexist boss who's obviously in the wrong. Fortunately, this isn't the case. Of course, Mr. White does reject her story, but it isn't because he's sexist. He called her in because they have two new interns starting that day, Clark and Jimmy, and she's the senior intern who needs to show them around. He ultimately rejects the story because giant robots and super military tech are too far-fetched of a story to run, especially without definitive evidence, which Lois didn't have. But here's the biggest point against Lois Lane as a Mary Sue. In this episode, even though Mr. White doesn't give Lois a chance and demands that she perform her duties as an intern, the episode doesn't write Mr. White as in the wrong. That place goes to Lois Lane. Following the rejection, Lois lies to Clark and Jimmy, telling them that Mr. White approved her story and that all three were officially on the case. On an interesting note, Lois Lane actually isn't the classic superwoman who can just do it all and don't need no man. Because, like any other person, she needs help. And for help, she employs the Daily Planet delivery kids to tell her any interesting thing of note they see along their routes, a service they demand payment for, forcing a situation that Clark must handle. This exchange leads them to a warehouse where the stolen tech had been kept, but moved recently. This is when Mr. White calls Clark, since Lois has been ignoring his calls, and then reveals the truth, that Lois has been lying. And what happened next came as one of the biggest subversions of expectations I have yet seen in modern media. It's Clark who calls Lois out on her wrongdoing. And while Lois Lane does get angry for being called out, she does end up apologizing profusely by the end. She knew she was in the wrong, and she still very much cared for Clark. So, what's the subversion? Well, it's Lois Lane actually being held accountable for her own actions. Oftentimes with Mary Sue's, you'll either get a May situation where she'll do something terrible but is instantly forgiven. Or, more likely, the classic Mary Sue relative morality thing kicks in, and she'll be written as either in the right or her wrongdoing is somehow justified, so the story will say it's okay. Oh, and anyone siding with the Mary Sue is also correct, while anyone siding against the Mary Sue is in the wrong. This even happens with the bad guys. How did we know that Kylo Ren was redeemable despite being a father-killing traitor and a mass murderer? Because he liked Rey, of course. Also, his uncle tried to kill him, so all that mass murdering is fine because he was sad. I'm pretty sure in the 2020 American media, being sad is the ultimate get out of hell free card. So, when Clark has the backbone to aggressively call Lois out on her lies, allow her to walk away, and then see Lois apologizing to Clark in the end, it was rather shocking. But more importantly, Lois Lane having both reason and accountability not only makes her more endearing and believable, but really hinders any accusation of Mary Sue tossed her way. But wait a minute, what about everything else? What about saving and even upstaging Superman? What about the complete Waifu Handbook? Stuart from the Loading Crew and LoadingCrewCrafts.com has unleashed upon this lonely world a legion of alluring waifus ready to travel at your side on your next epic adventure. The complete Waifu Handbook works with 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and Pathfinder 2nd edition, and not only includes a statted out roster of loyal love interests, but also 7 new races, over a dozen new classes, new backgrounds, camping activities, and even cooking mechanics. So build your camp, tell campfire stories and cook legendary meals to give your party the best advantage. The Waifu Handbook is already breaking all expectations, surpassing its $12,000 goal in a little over 30 minutes, and rose to over $40,000 in the first 24 hours. The project's campaign is well underway and will only be open on Kickstarter for a limited amount of time. So don't miss out, hit that follow button, order a copy on Kickstarter, and spice up your next campaign today with a spicy romance, because the waifus have arrived. Now, as I was saying, sure, Lois Lane helped Superman, and without her assistance, the mighty Man of Steel might have likely been slain. However, Lois Lane's role is handled differently here. Remember that instance where Ray fixes the Falcon better than Han? The reason why this became such a standard go-to in pointing out Ray's Mary Sue status is because the way it's written. It's more antagonistic towards the legacy character rather than cooperative. In gaming terms, an MMO or a D&D party would generally need a group of different characters with different skills to work as a team. When Ray fixes the Falcon, the scene reads less like teamwork and more like a comparison between the two characters who specialize in the same skill, your new character and your more experienced legacy character. So instead of the scene showing us how Ray and Han complement each other, it's showing us how much better Ray is than Han and how useless his character is compared to her. Almost like that scene in James Gunn's Suicide Squad, where Bloodsport finds out Peacemaker is being recruited onto the team and complains that Peacemaker's role on the team is the same as Bloodsport's. Needless to say, they spend the rest of the movie competing. However, poor Han doesn't really get to compete. The whole scene is just to show how much better Ray naturally is, at a skill that Han should, logically, be an expert in, humiliating Han while complimenting Ray. This is why the scene felt so hostile to so many fans, and why it felt so much like fan fiction. See, my totally original character is so much better than your dumb character from those dumb movies you like, because she can fix his shit better than him. With Lois Lane, the situation is not only complimentary, but well earned. As mentioned before, Lois Lane's main traits are revealed right from the start. We know she's brave, clever, and aggressive. She followed up on a story no one else wanted to take, made her own connections, and conducted her own investigation, eventually risking her own life to do so. To put it simply, Disney-era Mary Sues boil down to what they are. Rey is a super Jedi, so she gets a cool lightsaber and force abilities. Captain Marvel's a superhero, so she gets superpowers. Cruella was a fashion genius, so she just gets to skyrocket past her fashion mogul mother. Come to think of it, Cruella really feels like a movie written by D. Reynolds, especially after hearing her Moms Are Ugly song. In summary, these characters are defined by their role, what they do. And if Lois Lane had been written this way, her whole identity would be journalist. But she wasn't written that way. Unlike the others, Lois Lane in My Adventures with Superman actually has character, and therefore has characteristics, and they define who she is rather than a position she holds or role she performs. In other words, the modern empowerment Mary Sue is treated like a new Barbie. However, instead of Princess Barbie or Judge Barbie or Fat Barbie, it's Jedi Girl, Superhero Girl, or Villain Girl. And much like the unfortunate Ken doll, the men around these Mary Sues often exist to act as flunkies to make the Mary Sue look better by looking like idiots in front of the audience. This is why the writing needs to have Rey outdo Han in his area of expertise, rather than write her in a more cooperative role, i.e. making up for Han's weaknesses with her strengths. Fortunately, Lois Lane isn't written this way. She's not a soulless Barbie-like shell, so even though she isn't a journalist, we, the audience, can conclude on our own by virtue of her character that Lois could be and maybe even should be one. Now, how does this relate to her rescuing Superman? First, remember our discussion on character cooperation versus character competition? And remember that we were given Lois's character traits beforehand. What this means is that we know what her strengths are: bravery, ambition, and cleverness. So later in episode 1, when Clark steps in as Superman and is eventually overwhelmed by giant robots, Lois Lane uses these pre-established traits to help him when he's down. While he battles baddies, Lois Lane is brave enough to stay in the fray, and ambitious enough not merely to stay, but to take action. And she's clever enough to figure out how to switch off the robots. The same thing happens each time she helps Superman. It's not that Superman can't make the same connections as Lois, it's that Superman is the one who can face the danger and take the hits, while Lois Lane, who can't take the hits, can help in the background. Lois Lane lies, schemes, works extra hours, and takes the initiative to make her dream a reality. And even then, sometimes the fruits of her work are given away. Like the time another Daily Planet reporter got the credit for the hard work of Lois and her friends. So not only is Lois Lane forced to earn everything she gets, not only is she granted nothing she doesn't earn, but sometimes she even has what was rightfully earned stolen away. And she's left standing there helpless as everything she'd worked for is taken by the real reporters. This version of Lois Lane struggles, and we see her struggle. We see her fall, and we see her get back up. We even see her make mistakes, and then be held directly accountable for those mistakes. Sure, not by her boss necessarily, but by Clark, someone she arguably cares for about as much as she cares about becoming a journalist. And then she grows from the experience, forming a stronger trust and bond between herself, Jimmy, and Clark. The writers of Disney's Star Wars simply deemed Rey to be a Jedi, and so simply gave her the skills and powers the writers felt a Jedi should have, simply because a Jedi should have them, and not because she earned them or they even made any sense. Think of Rey's powers more like accessories that go with her Jedi costume, while Lois Lane's skills stem from her character, and so they feel far more organic and well-earned. And if all of these things weren't enough, there's still one major element to Lois Lane's character that Mary Sue's don't have. Flaws. I mean significant character flaws that actually prevent the character from achieving her goals. And Lois Lane's flaw stems from the exact same trait that forms some of her virtues. Lois Lane's ambition. A trait which made her a hard-hitting investigative journalist that cracked a dangerous story no one else would touch, and eventually allowed her to uncover Superman's identity when no one else could. And while Mr. White gave her stories to members of the Daily Planet who held the rank of journalist and refused to instantly grant her story assignments, his character is written to uphold the order of things, and his refusal to fast-track Lois despite her attitude is because she's so caught up in the romanticism of investigative journalism that she seems to dismiss the basics. Mr. White knows he's trying to run before she can walk, so it's not really just a matter of Lois Lane not putting in her time, but Lois not yet putting in the time to master the basics. Getting the story is only half the battle. The other side is the bureaucracy, the stuff she'll learn as an intern. And even if she won't have to do all the basic things as a promoted journalist, she'll still have knowledge and appreciation for the paper's inner workings. This is especially true since Mr. White thinks Lois is more about sensationalism and chasing the big story. In the words of Mr. White, "You do not report the news. You do not leave this building. Your job is to teach the interns how to scan things and make coffee." That's it. There is an order of things at the Daily Planet, and one cannot simply skip these steps because they feel like it. That being said, Lois's ambition does eventually pay off. She takes the initiative and makes a small meeting room for herself and her friends, in a place no one uses. Mr. White immediately finds out about this and does nothing. He's not against Lois taking a little space to grow, just concerned with keeping her ego in check. And Mr. White eventually grants Lois a story of her own. Okay, one might say, these are all rewards, but where's the flaw? Well, the flaw begins in the very first episode. For the good of me, you need to stop coming in with these wild ideas. Do what I tell you to do, Lane. This is your last chance. Which tells us that Lois Lane's aggressive attitude might grant her some advantages, but it also pushed her to neglect her other obligations and overstep her bounds to the point that Mr. White has been whittled down to granting Lois her last chance before terminating her employment. And still, Lois decides to gamble on her stolen robot story, putting her career and dream at risk. And unlike a Mary Sue situation, it isn't Mr. White who's treated as in the wrong. It's Lois Lane. For example, it's also clear right from the start that Lois likes Clark. However, she immediately chooses to lie to Clark and Jimmy, telling them that they've been assigned the story, jeopardizing their potential friendship. Lois would rather lie than risk the chance of the two saying no. The result? Mr. White tells Clark about Lois's deception. Clark then calls her out and things end on a sour note. Lois knows what she did wrong, and the show allows her to feel remorse about what she did to Clark, instead of righteously insisting that she was in the right. To quote, "What is wrong with your dumb, beautiful coward of a best friend? I mean, yes, I lied, but he wouldn't have helped me unless I had. Not like he helped me with the old lady with the bib, or helped me with Flip, or brought everyone donuts, or I was being selfish. I got him fired from his job, all to chase a bunch of robots that may not even be in the city anymore." The mix of accountability and self-reflection over wrongdoing isn't something a Mary Sue often goes through. So instead of a shallow moment reminding the audience of what a super cool character she is, we have a deeper character moment where she displays another dimension to that character. character. Mary Sue's are all about being right and awesome and super cool. Actual characters are all about failing sometimes and being at fault sometimes, and then correcting those failures and overcoming those faults. In the end, it was Lois Lane's string of lies and decisions that almost got them killed. If Clark wasn't Superman, he would have died. In fact, if Clark wasn't Superman, Lois's antics that day would likely have led them all to their untimely demise. And despite Lois's skill level, the reason why she hasn't been allowed to skip the line and go straight to reporter status is because she isn't ready. It isn't even a matter of Mr. White not giving her a chance, or a matter of Lois Lane's genius going unrecognized. It's that Lois still has legitimate lessons to learn before she goes professional. The biggest example is in episode 4 when Mr. White finally grants Lois Lane an assignment covering a grand gala event hosted by Dr. Ivo, an arrogant tech billionaire. The party is, of course, full of powerful and influential people, and Lois, of course, tries to get as many interviews as possible. However, this is when it becomes apparent that Lois lacks the skill for such a setting, and the aggressive attitude she uses to uncover stories in the city doesn't really go well amongst the cultured elite. So, when Lois starts shoving her tape recorder in the faces of various important people, demanding an interview like she's at a press conference, it doesn't go over well. Her attitude immediately scares any potential interviews away. She has raw talent, which gets her noticed and allows her to make progress, but her skills are yet unrefined. And it's her own lack of experience that hinders her central goal. In other words, Lois Lane is no social butterfly, and progress made towards her goal is hindered by her own personality flaws. A show like this could have easily fallen into the 2020 mantra of everything is men's fault, and had Lois making progress while Clark messed things up by being the one who's terrible with interviews. And then they get kicked out or something, and the story has Lois forgiving Clark to prove she's a compassionate character. The scenario would do nothing but lower Clark and raise Lois, but they didn't. As written, for the most part, Lois is a well-balanced character. It's her fault her plans for the party don't go the way she wanted, and it shows us that she has a lot left to learn. Remember character development? I know it's a lost art these days, but this is what a setup for one might be like. In fact, its absence has been a key factor in leading so many 2020-era female characters to ruin. As mentioned before, they've been little more than Barbies, merely assigned a set of abilities that go with their costume, with nothing to validate these abilities. Turns out My Adventures with Superman walks the road less traveled in the 2020 era of American media, and actually doesn't say Lois Lane deserves to be a journalist simply because she wants to be a journalist. In the situation where Lois discovers Clark's identity and gets angry, it's handled far better here than with Amber from Invincible. First off, Lois doesn't just know Clark's identity. She has to piece it together, and eventually resort to jumping off a building to force his secret into the light, without revealing too many details. Unlike Invincible, which forces Mark to bear the entire burden of guilt over the confrontation, despite constantly risking his life as a superhero, which Amber really should have considered since the main event that sparked her anger was the same event where Mark was brutalized trying to save a bunch of civilians, including her. Lois is angry because she liked Clark a lot, and her main worry was that their whole relationship was a lie, that Clark was just using their friendship as a cover. However, where Amber simply dismissed Mark with a cold disregard for his feelings, Lois actually considers Clark's feelings in the end. Clark reveals that he didn't tell because he didn't want to be treated differently or seen as an alien. He just wanted to be their friend. Both Lois and Jimmy understand, and all is forgiven. In summary, Lois deduces Clark's identity believably, is angry because she really liked Clark and thought this meant their whole relationship was a lie, you know, rather than Clark just missing a day at the soup kitchen or something. And Lois considers Clark's feelings and forgives him once she learns his motivations. A far cry from Amber, who gives Mark's feelings zero consideration. And the idea that Lois Lane might overtake Superman in his own show? While it's true that Lois Lane does get a lot of focus, the argument could be made that this is her show. After all, while the word Superman is in the title, he isn't alone. Remember, the show is called My Adventures with Superman. The word my indicates that Superman might be the main subject of the story, but perhaps not its main character. For example, if the book was called My Adventures with Sherlock Holmes, the main subject might be Sherlock Holmes, but it would be Watson's story to tell. Or in How I Met Your Mother, the mother is the main subject of the story, but Ted Mosby is the central character. So yes, Superman is a huge part of the story, but Lois just might be the one telling it. In the end, My Adventures with Superman was was a pleasant surprise. A rare silver in a river full of corporate Mary Sue muck. And I really hope it isn't ruined later down the line with repugnant political nonsense. As mentioned before, Lois and Clark are both essential to the story. They're two pieces that make a complete picture. And what makes the show work overall is the fact that it seems to understand Superman as well. To recall my old Superman video from some time back, I pointed out that as long as evil exists, a figure like Superman will always be relevant. The real Superman, the guy who does the right thing, who even other heroes turn to when they're lost, the guy who's your friend when you need him most. The very fact that I'm covering a popular new Superman show years after that video, I think, bolsters my claim. And when we see Superman saving cats from trees and helping old ladies, and saying things like, "The truth is, I'm still piecing together who I am and what I can do, but at the end of the day, I'm here to help the people of Metropolis. That's what matters." The show writes him as a superhero, yes, but also remembers that he's a man, not a god. And like any other person, any other man, he can falter and fail. Like any other person, including Lois Lane, even he needs help sometimes. It becomes very clear that we have left the Zack Snyder nonsense behind us, and that this Superman is the kind-hearted defender of humanity we've come to know. From the guy who goes for a morning jog, who shows up to work on time, the guy who brings donuts for his coworkers just because he thought it would be nice, to the hero who saves the day with a hopeful smile. This is the Superman, the Clark Kent, that Lois falls in love with.